Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from Interest.co.nz and welcome to a special housing report brought to you in association with BNZ. Today I want to have a look at the Reserve Bank and property bubbles. The International Monetary Fund has come out with its post-mortem of what central banks should have done and didn't do before the global financial crisis. There's a couple of reasons that we had the global financial crisis. Some of them were to do with central banks. All around the world, central banks, although not so much in New Zealand, kept their interest rates very low for a long period of time and essentially ignored property asset bubbles. In the United States, house prices surged and the Reserve Bank there, or the US Federal Reserve, decided not to put up interest rates to try and prick this bubble. They argued that Reserve banks were not very good at identifying when bubbles had happened and what to do with them. And there was the danger that if you targeted an asset bubble, you'd actually hurt the underlying economy. So they let it run. And that, to an extent, was what happened in New Zealand. All from 2002 to 2007, when house prices doubled, the Reserve Bank was focused solely on inflation and using the official cash rate to do it. The trouble was, though, not focusing on those asset bubbles, and in particular the house price bubble, meant that it was always behind the game, behind what was happening in the real economy. As asset prices jumped, house prices jumped, that flowed through in higher prices in the rest of the economy, as people took advantage of the extra wealth, or what they thought was wealth, to go spending in the consumer economy, pushing up inflationary pressures. That meant the Reserve Bank was always behind the eight ball and putting up the official cash rate slower and later than it perhaps should have. We got to the point where the official cash rate got up to 8.25% in late 2007, early 2008. Now the question is, should the Reserve Bank here, and Reserve banks all around the world, should they have targeted those property bubbles? Well, the International Monetary Fund says yes, it's time to reopen the debate on pricking asset bubbles. My personal view is that the Reserve Bank should look at this. The Reserve Bank has been focused in the past on using a single policy tool to target inflation alone. But in the last couple of years, that stance has softened a bit. They've started to look at macroprudential tools, alternatives, or at least extras, to the official cash rate. And we've seen that with the introduction of the core funding ratio, which is, in theory, a macroprudential tool. Now, this isn't designed to focus on inflation, or on asset bubbles for that matter, but simply to keep the system stable. Remember, everyone got a real shock at the end of 2008, early 2009, when banks found it difficult to fund their short-term borrowing, particularly the overseas borrowing, in international money markets. So the Reserve Bank has forced them, through the core funding ratio, to borrow more of their money locally and for longer terms to make it more stable. The question is, are there other macroprudential tools the Reserve Bank could use to try and keep these asset bubbles under control? Now, the Reserve Bank actually looked at some of these in 2006 and decided it wasn't such a good idea. But maybe now it's time to have a look at some of these other tools again, particularly the loan-to-value ratio, which some other banks look at. And finally, let's have a look at whether we really are in bubble territory. This is a hot debate, obviously. A lot of people believe that house prices actually make sense at current levels in New Zealand, that there is adequate supply and adequate demand, and that people can afford it. Well, my view, and that particularly in the large centres, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Hamilton, Tauranga, prices are still well out of whack with underlying income fundamentals. When you look at the Roost Home Loan Affordability Report, which we produce here at Interest.co.nz, it shows that in New Zealand right now, it costs almost 60% of the after-tax median wage to pay for the mortgage on a median house. And when you look at price-to-income multiples, we're still at perhaps double the levels you'll see overseas. Now, you can argue about this, but it's pretty clear that we have had a property bubble in New Zealand, certainly in the last 3 or 4 years. It's subsided somewhat, and affordability is better than it was, but certainly the Reserve Bank needs to look at asset bubbles, particularly house price bubbles, and look at ways in which perhaps they can find other tools to try and take some of the air out of these things before they get too big. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a special housing report brought to you in association with BNZ.